The Manchurian Candidate by Richard Condon. This book consists of 30 chapters. To Max Youngstein, and not only for reasons of affection and admiration, this book is warmly dedicated. The Order of Assassins was founded in Persia at the end of the 11th century. They were committed to anyone willing to pay for the service. Assassins were skeptical of the existence of God and believed that the world of the mind came into existence first, then finally the rest of creation. Standard Dictionary of Folklore, Mythology, and Legend. I am you, and you are me, and what have we done to each other? The Keener's Manual. Chapter 1. It was sunny in San Francisco, a fabulous condition. Raymond Shaw was not unaware of the beauty outside the hotel window, across from a mansion on the top of a hill, but he clutched the telephone like an osculatorium, and did not allow himself to think about what lay beyond that instant, in a saloon someplace, in a different bed, or anywhere. His lumpy sergeant's uniform was heaped on a chair. He stretched out on the rented bed, wearing a new $120 dark blue dressing gown, and waited for the telephone operator to complete the chain of calls to locate Ed Malvolio's father somewhere in St. Louis. He knew he was doing the wrong thing. 2 years of Korean duty were 3 days behind him, and at the very least he should be spending his money on a taxicab to go up and down those hills in the sunshine. But he decided his mind must be bent, or that he was drunk with compassion or something else improbable like that. Of all the fathers of all the fallen whom he had to call, owing to his endemic mopery, this one had to work nights, because by now it must be dark in St. Louis. He listened to the operator get through to the switchboard at the Post-Dispatch. He heard the switchboard tell her that Malvolio's father worked in the composing room. A man talked to a woman. There was silence. Raymond stared at his own large toe. "Hello?" A very high voice. "Mr. Arthur Malvolio, please, long-distance calling." The steady rumble of working presses filled the background. "This is him." "Mr. Arthur Malvolio?" Yeah. "Go ahead, please." Hello, Mr. Malvolio. This is Sergeant Shaw. I'm calling from San Francisco. I was in Eddie's outfit, Mr. Malvolio." "My Ed's outfit?" "Yes, sir." "Ray Shaw?" "Yes, sir." "The Ray Shaw, who won the Medal of—" "Yes, sir." Raymond cut him off in a louder voice. He felt like dropping the phone, the call, and the whole soggy, masochistic, suicidal thing in the wastebasket. Better yet, he should whack himself over the head with the goddamn phone. "You see, Mr. Malvolio, I have to, go to Washington, and we know. We read all about it. And let me say with all my heart I got left that I am as proud of you, even though I never met you, as if it were Eddie, my own kid, my son." "Mr. Malvolio," Raymond said rapidly, "I thought that if it was okay with you, maybe I could stop over in St. Louis on my way to Washington, you know? It occurred to me that you and Mrs. Malvolio might get some kind of peace out of it, some kind of relief, if we talked a little bit. About Eddie, you know? I thought that was the least I could do." There was a silence. Then Mr. Malvolio began to make a lot of slobbering sounds, so Raymond said roughly that he would wire when he knew what flight he would be on, and he hung up the phone and felt like an idiot. Like an angry man with a cane who pokes a hole through the floor of heaven and is scalded by the joy that pours down upon him, Raymond had a capacity for using satisfactions against himself. When he got off the plane at St. Louis Airport, he felt like running. He decided Malvolio's father must be that midget with the eyeglasses like milk bottle bottoms who was enjoying sweating so much. The man would be all over him like a charging elk in a minute. Hold it, the pimply press photographer said loudly. "Put it down," Raymond snarled in a voice which was even more unpleasant than his normal voice. All at once the photographer was less sure of himself. "What's the matter?" he asked in bewilderment, because he lived at a time when only sex criminals and dope peddlers tried to refuse to have their pictures taken by the press. "I flew all the way in here to see Ed Malvolio's father," Raymond said, despising himself for throwing up such corn. "You want a picture? Go find him, because you ain't going to take one of me without he's in it." Listen to that genuine bluff sergeant version of Polizze Verso, Raymond cried out to himself. I am playing the authentic war buddy so deeply that I will have to mail in a royalty check for the stock rights. Look at that clown of a photographer trying to cope with phenomena. Any minute now he will realize that he is standing right beside Malvolio's father. "Oh, Sergeant," the girl said, so then he knew who she was. She wasn't red-eyed and runny-nosed with grief for the dead hero, so she had to be the cub reporter who had been assigned to write the big local angle on the White House and the hero, and he had probably written the lead for her with that sappy grandstand play. "I'm Ed's father," the sweat manufacturer said. It was December, for gosh sake. What's with all the dew? "I'm Arthur Mavole. I'm sorry about this. I just happened to mention at the paper that you had called all the way from San Francisco and that you had offered to stop over and see Eddie's mother on the way to the White House, and the word somehow got upstairs to the city desk, and, well, that's the newspaper business, I guess." Raymond took 3 steps forward, grasped Mr. Mavole's hand, gripped his right forearm with his own left hand, transmitted the steely glance and the iron stare and the frozen fix. He felt like Captain Idiot in one of those space comic books, and the photographer got the picture and lost all interest in them. "May I ask how old you are, Sergeant Shaw?" the young chick said, notebook ready, pencil poised as though she and Mavole were about to give him a fitting, and he figured reflexively that this could be the first assignment she had ever gotten after years of journalism school and months of social notes from all over. He remembered his first assignment and how he had feared the waffle-faced movie actor who had opened the door of the hotel suite wearing only pajama bottoms, with corny tattoos like "So long, Mabel" on each shoulder. Inside the suite, Raymond had managed to convey that he would just as soon have hit the man as talked to him, and he had said, "Give me the handout and we can save some time." The traveling press agent with the actor, a plump, bloodshot type whose glasses kept sliding down his nose, had said, "What handout?" He had snarled that maybe they would prefer it if he started out by asking what was the great man's hobby and what astrology sign he had been born under. It was hard to believe, but that man's face had been as pocked and welted as a waffle, yet he was one of the biggest names in the business, which gives an idea what those swine will do to kid the jerky public. The actor had said, "Are you scared, kid?" Then after that everything seemed to go okay. They got along like a bucket of chums. The point was, everybody had to start someplace. Although he felt like a slob himself for doing it, he asked Mr. Mavole and the girl if they would have time to have a cup of coffee at the airport restaurant, because he was a newspaper man himself, and he knew that the little lady had a story to get. The little lady. That was overdoing it. He'd have to find a mirror and see if he had a wing collar on. "You were?" the girl said. "Oh, Sergeant." Mr. Mavole said a cup of coffee would be fine with him, so they went inside. They sat down at a table in the coffee shop. The windows were steamy. Business was very quiet, and unfortunately the waitress seemed to have nothing but time. They all ordered coffee, and Raymond thought he'd like to have a piece of pie, but he could not bring himself to decide what kind of pie. Did everybody have to look at him as though he were sick, because he couldn't set his taste buds in advance to be able to figure which flavor he would favor before he tasted it? Did the waitress just have to start out to recite, "We have peach pie and pumpkin," and they'd all just yell out, "Peach, peach, peach"? What was the sense of eating in a place where they gabbled the menu at you anyway? If a man were intelligent and he sorted through the memories of past tastes, he not only could get exactly what he wanted sensually and with a flavor sensation, but he would probably be choosing something so chemically exact that it would benefit his entire body. But how could anyone achieve such a considerate, deliberate result as that unless one were permitted to pore over a written menu? "The prune pie is very good, sir," the waitress said. He told her he'd take the prune pie, and he hated her in a hot, resentful flash, because he did not want prune pie. He hated prune pie, and he had been maneuvered into ordering prune pie by a rube waitress who would probably slobber all over his shoes for a quarter tip. "I wanted to tell you how we felt about Ed, Mr. Mavole," Raymond said. "I want to tell you that of all the guys I ever met, there was never a happier, sweeter, or more solid guy than your son Ed." The little man's eyes filled. He suddenly choked on a sob so loud that people at the counter, which was quite a distance away, turned round. Raymond spoke to the girl quickly to cover up. "I'm 24 years old. My astrological sign is Pisces. A very fine lady reporter on a Detroit paper once told me always to ask for their astrology sign because people love to read about astrology if they don't have to ask for it directly." "I'm Taurus," the girl said. "We'd be very good," Raymond said. She let him see just a little bit behind her expression. "I know," she said. Mr. Mavole spoke in a soft voice. "Sergeant, you see, well, when Eddie got killed, his mother had a heart attack, and I wonder if you could spare maybe a half an hour out and back. We don't live all the way into the city, and Oh, Jesus. Raymond saw himself donning the bedside manner, a bloody cardiac. The slightest touchy thing he said to her could knock the old cat over sideways with an off-key moan. But what could he do? He had elected himself head chump when he had stepped down from Valhalla and telephoned this sweaty little advantage-taker. "Mr. Mavoli," he said, slowly and softly, "I don't have to be in Washington until the day after tomorrow, but I figured I would allow a day and a half in case of bad weather, you know, on account of the White House. I can even get to Washington by train from here overnight, the Spirit of St. Louis, the same name as that plane with that fella. So please don't think I would even think of leaving town without talking to Mrs. Mavoli, Eddie's mother." He looked up and he saw how the girl was looking at him. She was a very pretty girl, a sweet-looking, nice, blonde girl. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mardell," she said. "Do you think I'll be able to get a hotel here tonight?" "I'm absolutely sure of it." "I'll take care of that, Sergeant," Mr. Mavoli said hurriedly. "In fact, the paper will take care of everything. You would certainly be welcome to stay at our place, but we just had the painters. Smells so sharp your eyes water." Raymond called for the check. They drove to the Mavolis. Mardell said she'd wait in the car and just to forget about her. Raymond told her to get on into the paper and file her story, then drive back out to pick him up. She stared at him as if he had invented balk-line billiards. He patted her cheek, then went into the house. She put her hand on her stomach and took 3 or 4 very deep breaths. Then she started the car and went into town. The session with Mrs. Mavoli was awful, and Raymond vowed that he would never take an intelligence test because they might lock him up as a result of what would be shown. Any cretin could have looked ahead and seen what a mess this was going to be. They all cried. People can certainly carry on, he thought, holding her fat hand because she had asked him to, and feeling sure she was going to drop dead any minute. These were the people who let a war start. Then they act surprised when their own son is killed. Mavoli was a good enough kid. He certainly was a funny kid, and with a sensational disposition, but what the hell? 20,000 were dead out there so far on the American panel, plus the UN guys, and maybe 60, 80,000 more all shot up, and this fat broad seemed to think that Mavoli was the only one who got it. Could my mother take it this big if I got it? Would anyone living or anyone running a legitimate seance which picked up guaranteed answers from out yonder ever be able to find out whether she could feel anything at all about anything or anybody? Let her little Raymond pull up dead, and he knew the answer from his little mommy. If the folks would pay 1 or more votes for a sandwich, she would be happy to send for her little boy's body and barbecue him. "I can tell you that it was a very clear action for a night action, Mrs. Mavoli," Raymond said. Mr. Mavoli sat on the other side of the bed and stared at the floor, his eyes feverish captives in black circles, his lower lip caught between his teeth, his hands clasped in prayer, as he hoped he would not begin to cry again and start her crying. "You see, Captain Marco had sent up some low flares because we had to know where the enemy was. They knew where we were. Eddie, well..." He paused, only infinitesimally, to try not to weep at the thought of how bitter, bitter, bitter it was to have to lie at a time like this. But she had sold the boy to the recruiters for this moment, so he would have to throw the truth away and pay her off. They never told the folks back home about the filthy deaths, the grotesque, debasing deaths, which were almost all the deaths in war. Dirty deaths were the commonplace clowns smoking idle cigarettes backstage at a circus filled with clowns. Ah, no. Only a clutch of martial airs played on an electric guitar and sung through the gaudy jukebox called Our Nation's History. He didn't know exactly how Mavoli caught it, but he could figure it close. He'd probably gotten about 16 inches of bayonet in the rectum as he turned to get away, and his screaming had scared the other man so much that he had fought to get his weapon out and run away, twisting Mavoli on it until the point came out under Mavoli's ribs, where the diaphragm was, and the man had had to put his foot on the back of Mavoli's neck, breaking his nose and cheekbone to get the sticker out while he whimpered in Chinese and wanted to lie down somewhere where it was quiet. All the other people knew about how undignified it was to lose a head or some legs or a body in a mass attack, except his people, the innocents hiding in the jam jar. Women like this one might have had the little cardiac murmur stilled if her city had been bombed and she had seen her Eddie with no lower face, and she had to protect and cherish the rest, the ones who were left. Well, there was this very young lad in our outfit, Mrs. Mavoli. He was maybe 17 years old, but I doubt it. I think 16. Eddie had decided a long time ago to help the kid and look out for him, because that was the kind of man your son was." Mr. Mavoli was sobbing very softly on the other side of the bed. "Well, little Bobby Limbeck got separated from the rest of us. Not by far. Ed went out to cover him. The boy was hit just before Eddie could make it to him. And, well, he just couldn't leave him there, you know? That's the kind of a man I mean. That was Ed, you know? He couldn't. He tried to bring the youngster back, and by that time the enemy had a fix on them, and they dropped a mortar shell on them from away up high. And it was all over and all done, Mrs. Mavoli, before those two boys felt a single thing. That's how quick it was, Mrs. Mavoli. Yes, ma'am, that quick." "I'm glad," Mrs. Mavoli said. Then suddenly and loudly she said, "Oh, my God, how can I say I'm glad? I'm not. We're all a long time dead. He was such a happy little boy, and he'll be a long time dead." She was propped up among the pillows of the bed, and her body moved back and forth with her keening. What the hell did he expect? He came here of his own free will. What did he expect? 2 choruses of something mellow, progressive, and fine? Oh, man, oh, man, oh, man. A fat old broad in a 9x9 box with a sweat-maker who can't get with it. "How can I continue to live," he shouted at high scream under the nave of his encompassing skull, "if people are going to continue to carry bundles of pain on top of their heads like Haitian laundresses, then fling the bundles at random into the face of any bright stroller who happened to be passing by? All right. He had helped this fat broad to find herself some ghoulish kicks. What did they want from him?" "The wrong man died, Mrs. Mavoli," Raymond sobbed. "How I wish it could have been me, not Eddie. Me. He hid his face in her large, motherly breasts as she lay back on the pillows of the bed. Through arrangements beyond his control, Raymond had developed into a man who sagged fearfully within a suit of stifling armor, imprisoned for the length of his life from casque to sollerette. It was heavy, immovable armor, this thick defense which had been constructed mainly at his mother's forge, hammered under his stepfather's noise, tempered by the bitter tears of his father's betrayal. Raymond also distrusted all other living people because they had not warned his father of his mother. Raymond had been shown too early that if he smiled, his stepfather was encouraged to bray laughter. If he spoke, his mother felt compelled to reply in the only way she knew how to reply, which was to urge him to seek popularity and power with all life force. So he had deliberately developed the ability to be shunned instantly no matter where he went, and notwithstanding extraneous conditions. He had achieved this state consciously after year upon year of unconscious rehearsal of the manifest paraphernalia of arrogance and contempt, then exceeded it. The shell of armor that encased Raymond, by the horrid tracery of its design, presented him as one of the least likable men of his century. He knew that to be a fact, and yet he did not know it, because he thought the armor was all one with himself, as is a turtle's shell. He had been told who he was only by his whimpering, unconscious mind. A motherless by choice, fatherless by treachery, friendless by circumstance, and joyless by consequence man who would continue to refuse emphatically to live, and who, autocratically and unequivocally, did not intend to die. He was a marooned balloonist, supported by nothing visible, looking down on everybody and everything, but yearning to be seen, so that at least he could be given some credit for an otherwise profitless ascension. That was what Raymond's ambivalence was like. He was held in a paradox of callousness and feeling, the armor which he told the world he was, and the feeling which was what he did not know he was, and blind to both in a darkness of despair which could neither be seen nor see itself. He had been able to weep with Mr. and Mrs. Mavoli because the door had been closed, and because he knew he would be careful never to be seen by those two slobs again. At 7:20 on the morning after he had reached St. Louis, there was a discreet but firm knocking at Raymond's hotel room door. These peremptory sounds just happened to come at a moment when Raymond was exchanging intense joy with the young newspaper woman he had met the day before. When the knocking had first hit the door, Raymond had heard it clearly enough, but he was just busy enough to be determined to ignore it. But the young woman had gone rigid, not in any attitude of idiosyncratic orgasm, but as any healthy, respectable young woman would have done under similar circumstances in a hotel room in any city smaller than Tokyo. Lights of rage and resentment exploded in Raymond's head. He stared down at the sweet, frightened face under him, as though he hated her for not being as defiant as a drunken whore in a night court. Then he threw himself off her, nearly falling out of bed. He regained his balance, slowly pulled on the dark blue dressing gown, and walking very close to the door of the room, said into the crack, "Who is it?" "Sergeant Shaw?" "Yes." "Federal Bureau of Investigation." It was a calm, sane, tenor voice. "What?" Raymond said. "Come on." His voice was low and angry. "Open up." Raymond looked over his shoulder, registering amazement, either to see whether Mardell had heard what he had heard, or to find out if she looked like a fugitive. She was chalk white and solemn. "What do you want?" Raymond asked. "We want Sergeant Raymond Shaw." Raymond stared at the door. His face began to fill with a claret flush that clashed unpleasantly with the Nile green wallpaper directly beside him. "Open up," the voice said. "I will like hell open up," Raymond said. "How dare you pound on this door at this time of the morning and issue your country constable's orders? There are telephones in the lobby if you needed to make some kind of urgent inquiry. I said, how dare you?" The hauteur in Raymond's voice held no bluster, and its threat of implicit punishment startled the girl on the bed even more than the FBI's arrival. "What the hell do you want from Sergeant Raymond Shaw?" he snarled. "Well, we have been asked." "Asked? Asked?" "We have been asked to see that you meet the Army plane, which is being sent to pick you up at the Lambert Airport in an hour and 15 minutes, at 8:45. "You couldn't have called me from your home or some law school telephone booth?" There was a strained silence then. "We will not continue to discuss this with you from behind a door." Raymond walked quickly to the telephone. He was stiff with anger, as though it had rusted his joints. He picked up the receiver and rattled the bar. He told the operator to please get him the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. "Sergeant," the voice said distinctly through the door, "we have orders to put you on that plane. Our orders are just as mandatory as any you ever got in the Army." "Listen to what I'm going to say on this phone, and then we'll talk about orders," Raymond said nastily. "I don't take any orders from the FBI, or the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, or the Division of Conservation and Wildlife. And if you have any written orders for me from the United States Army, slide them under the door. Then you can wait for me in the lobby if you still think you have to, and the Air Force can wait for me at the airport until I make my mind up. Now, just 1 minute here, son." The voice had turned ominous. "Did they tell you I am being flown to Washington to get a Medal of Honor at the White House?" Maybe that silly hunk of iron he had never asked for would be useful for something just once. This kind of a square bought that stuff. A Medal of Honor was like a lot of money. It was very hard to get, so it took on a lot of magic powers. "Are you that Sergeant Shaw?" "That's me." He spoke to the phone. "Right, I'll hold on." "I'll wait in the lobby," the FBI man said. "I'll be standing near the desk when you come down. Sorry." Holding the telephone and waiting for the call, Raymond sat down on the edge of the bed, then leaned over and kissed the girl very softly at a soft place right under her rigid right nipple. But he didn't smile at her because he was preoccupied with the call. "Hello, Mayflower. This is St. Louis, Missouri, calling Senator John Iselin. Sergeant Raymond Shaw." There was a short wait. "Hello, Mother. Put your husband on. It's Raymond." "I said put your husband on." He waited. "Johnny?" "Raymond, there's an FBI man outside my hotel room door in St. Louis to say that they are holding an Army plane for me. Did you tell the Army to request FBI cooperation? And did you have that plane sent here?" He listened. "You did. Well, I knew damn well you did. But why? What the hell did you decide to do a thing like that for?" He listened. "How could I be late? It's Wednesday morning, and I don't have to be at the White House until Friday afternoon." He listened. He went totally pale. "A parade? A parade?" He stared at the details offered by his imagination. "Why, you cheap, flag-rubbing bastard." Mardell had slipped out of bed and was starting to get dressed, but she didn't seem to be able to find anything, and she looked frightened. He signaled her with his free hand, caught her attention, and smiled at her so warmingly and so reassuringly that she sat down on the edge of the bed. Then she leaned back slowly and stretched out. He reached over and took her hand, kissed it softly, then placed it on top of her flat, smooth stomach, while the telephone squawked in his ear. She reached up and just barely allowed her hand to caress the length of his right cheek, unshaven. Suddenly, his face went hard again, and he barked into the telephone. "No, don't put my mother on again. I know I haven't spoken to her in 2 years. I'll talk to her when I'm good and ready to talk to her. Ah, for Christ's sake." He gritted his teeth and stared at the ceiling. "Hello, Mother." His voice was flat. "Raymond, what the hell is this?" his mother asked solicitously. "What's the matter with you? If we were in the mining business and you struck gold, you'd call us, wouldn't you? No. Well, it just so happens that you're a Medal of Honor winner. Incidentally, congratulations. I meant to write, but we've been jammed up. Johnny is a public figure, Raymond. He represents the people of your state just the same as the president represents the people of the United States. And I notice you aren't making any fuss about going to the White House. Is there something so slimy and so terrible about having your picture taken with your father? He is not my father, who represents the pride the people of this nation feel for what you have sacrificed for them on the field of battle. Ah, for Christ's sakes, Mother, will you please? You didn't mind having your picture taken with that stranger in St. Louis yesterday. Incidentally, what happened? Did the Army PRO send you in there to slobber over the gold star, Mother? It was my own idea. Don't tell me that, Raymond, darling. I just happened to know you. It was my own idea. Well, wonderful. It was a wonderful idea. All the papers carried it here yesterday, and of course everywhere this morning. Marty Weber called in time, so we were able to work in a little expression from Johnny about how he'd do anything to help that dead boy's folks, and so forth. So we tied everything up from this end. It was great. So you certainly can't stand there and tell me that you won't have your picture taken with the man who is not only your own family, but who happens to have been the governor and is now the senator from your own state. Since when do you have to get the Army to ask the FBI to set up a picture for Johnny? And that's not what we're arguing about anyway. He just told me about a filthy idea for a parade to commemorate a medal on which you and I might not place any particular value, but which the rest of this country thinks is a nice little thing, for a few lousy votes for him. And I am not going to hold still for any cheap goddamn parade. A parade? That's ridiculous. Ask your flag-simple husband. Raymond's mother seemed to be talking across the mouthpiece in an aside to Johnny, but Johnny had left the apartment some 4 minutes before to get a haircut. Johnny, she said to nobody at all, where did you get the idea that they could embarrass Raymond with a parade? No wonder he's so sore. Into the telephone she said, It's not a parade. A few cars were going out to the airport to meet you. No marching men, no color guard, no big bands. You know you are a very peculiar boy, Raymond. I haven't seen you for almost 2 years. Your mother. But you go right on mewing about some parade and Johnny and the FBI and some Army plane. But when it comes to what else is going to happen in Washington, I had planned a little luncheon. With whom? With some very important key press and television people. And Johnny? Of course. No. What? I won't do it. There was a long pause. Waiting, staring down at the girl, he became aware that she had violet eyes. His mind began to spin off the fine silk thread of his resentment in furious moulinage. For almost 2 years he had been free of his obsessed mother, this brassy bugler, this puss in boots to her boorish Marquis de Carabas, the woman who could think but who could not feel. He had had 3 letters from her in 2 years. One, she had arranged for a life-sized cutout of Johnny to be forwarded to Seoul. General MacArthur was in the area. Would he arrange for a picture of the two of them with arms around the photographic cutout of Johnny, as she could guarantee that this would get the widest kind of coverage? 2, would he arrange for a canvass of fighting men from their state to sign a scroll of Christmas greetings on behalf of all Johnny's fighting buddies everywhere, to Johnny and the people of his great state? And 3, she was deeply disappointed and not a little bit shocked to find out that he would not lift one little finger to carry out a few simple requests for his mother, who worked day and night for both of her men so that there might be a better and more secure place for each of them. He had been 2 years away from her, but he could feel his defiance of her buckling under the weight of her silence. He had never been able to cope with her silence. At last her voice came through the telephone again. It was changed. It was rough and sinister. It was murderous and frightening and threatening. If you don't do this, Raymond, she said, I will promise you on my father's grave right now that you will be very, very sorry. All right, Mother, he said. I'll do it. He shuddered. He hung up the telephone from 1.5 feet above the receiver. It fell off, but he must have felt he had made his point, because he picked it up from the bed where it had bounced and put it gently into its cradle. That was my mother, he explained to Mardell. I wish I knew what else I could say to describe her in front of a nice girl like you. He walked to the locked door. He leaned against the crack in despair and said, I'll be in the lobby in about an hour. There was no answer. He turned toward the bed, untying the belt of his new blue robe, as a massive column of smoke began to spiral upwards inside his head, filling the eyes of his memory and opaquing his expression from behind his eyes. Mardell was spilled out softly across the bed. The sheets were blue. She was blonde and ivory, tipped with pink, lined with pink. It came to him that he had never seen another girl named Josie this way. The thought of Josie lying before him like this lovely, moaning girl excited him as though a chemical abrasive had been poured into his urethra, and she was assaulted by him in the most attritive manner, to her greater glory and with her effulgent consent. And though she lived to be an old, old woman, she never forgot that morning, and could summon it back to her in its richest violence whenever she was frightened and alone, never knowing that she was not only the first woman Raymond had ever possessed, but the first he had ever kissed in passion, or that he had been given his start toward relaxing his inhibitions against the uses of sex not quite 1 year before in Manchuria. Chapter 2. A Chinese Army construction battalion arrived at Tung Hua, 43 miles inside the Korean frontier, on July 4, 1951, to set underway the housing for events planned in 1936 that were to reach their conclusion in the United States of America in 1960. The major in charge of the detail, Tsu Ma Sung, is now a civilian lawyer in Kunming. Manchuria is in the subarctic zone, but the summers are hot and humid. Tung Hua handles industries such as sawmilling and food processing with hydroelectric power. It is a city of approximately 90,000, about the size of Terre Haute, Indiana, but lacking a public health appropriation. The Chinese construction battalion set up the job near a military airfield nearly 3 miles out of town. Everything they put up was prefabricated, the sections keyed by different colors. This, when the pieces were scattered around the terrain, made the men seem like toy figures walking among the pieces of a giant jigsaw puzzle. When these were assembled into a building, they were sprayed with barn-red lead paint to banish the quilted effect. By July 6th at 1719, the battalion had completed a 2-story, 22-room structure with a small auditorium. The building was called the Research Pavilion and had some one-way transparent glass walls. It also had a few comfortably furnished guest rooms without glass walls on the first floor. These had been reserved for the brass from Moscow and Peiping. Each floor held different colored, vari-patterned asphalt tile as a guide for furniture and equipment placement. Each wall, as it was erected, had decorations riveted into it. The windows, cut through each outer wall, had curtains and drapes fastened to them. The 1,000 pieces of that house gave the impression that it was a traveling billet for political representatives of the Allied people's governments. A structure forever being built, struck, then sent on ahead to be built again for the next series of meetings and discussions. All of the furniture was made of blonde wood in mutated, modern Scandinavian design. All of the interior coloring, except the bright yellow rattan carpeting on the second floor, was the same green and apricot utilized by new brides during their first 3 years of marriage. The second floor of the building held one large corner suite of rooms and 10 other compact cubicles that had 3 solid walls each and one building-long common wall of one-way transparent glass facing a catwalk that was patrolled day and night by 2 Soviet Army riflemen. Each cubicle contained a cot, a chair, a closet, and a mirror for reassurance that the soul had not fled. The large apartment had similar fittings, plus a bathroom, a large living room, and an additional bedroom. All of the walls here were opaque. The invigorating scent of pine tree incense pervaded the upper floors, subtly and pleasantly. The marvelous part of what they were doing several hundred miles to the south of Tung Hua was that every time Mavole moved, the girl moved. And every time Mavole bleated, the girl bleated. It was really a money's worth. And after Mavole came downstairs, he told the guys that the classy part about the joint was that when he took the broad upstairs in the first place, there had been no jeers or catcalls. Mavole's co-mover and bleater was a young Korean girl who had adapted to prostitution a variation of the Rochdale principle on which had been based the first cooperative store in 1844, in that she extended absolutely no credit, but distributed part of the profits in the form of free beer. Her name was Gertrude. Freeman had left to check gear, but Mavoli and Bobby Limbeck sat around and drank a few more beers while they waited for the corporal to get finished upstairs. They tried to explain to the two little broads that it was not necessary to smile so hard, but they couldn't speak Korean, except for a few words, and the girls couldn't speak American. So Bobby Limbeck put his two forefingers at the corners of his mouth and pulled an inane prop smile down. The girls caught on, but it looked so funny the way he did it that Bobby and Mavoli started laughing like crazy, which started the girls laughing again, so that when they stopped laughing, they were still smiling. To the extent that wartime zymergists imperil the norm, the Korean beer was about as good as local Mississippi beer, or Nebraska beer, which is pretty lousy, but it was hot. That was one thing you could say about it, Mavoli pointed out. "Eddie, why do we have to spend all of our time off in a whorehouse?" Bobby asked. "Yeah, rough, ain't it?" "I don't mean it's hard to take, but my hobby is birds. There are a lot of new birds around this part of the world. We spend our time off here because it's the only place on the entire Korean peninsula that Sergeant Raymond Shaw doesn't walk into." "You think he's a fairy or very religious?" "What? Or both? Sergeant Shaw? Our Raymond? Yeah. What are you, out of your mind? It's just that Raymond doesn't give to anybody, and it's a common, vulgar thing, sex, to Raymond." "He happens to be right," Bobby Limbeck said. "It sure is. I'm only a beginner, but that's one of the things I like about it." Mavoli looked at him, nodding his head in a kind of awe. "It's a very funny thing," he said slowly, "but every now and then I think about you coming all the way to Korea from New Jersey to get your first piece of poontang, and it makes me feel like I'm sort of a monument, part of your life, you know? And Marie Louise, too, of course." He nodded equably to indicate the small Japanese girl who was sitting beside Bobby Limbeck, holding his right wrist like a falcon. "She certainly is," Bobby agreed. "What a monument." "It's kind of a very touching thing to me that you have never had a fat broad or a tall broad say. It's different." "Well, yes and no. It's hard to explain. These little broads, while very nice, and with lovely dispositions, and with beer included, which is very unusual, they are very little. Spinners, we used to call them. Although I hate to say this, even though I know they can't understand me, they are very, very skinny." "Just the same," Bobby said. "Yeah, you're right." Melvin, the corporal, came rushing down the stairs. He was combing his hair rapidly, head tilted to one side like a commuter who had overslept. "Great," he said briskly. "Great, great, great," he repeated, running the words together. "The greatest." "You're telling me?" asked Bobby Limbeck. "Look at him," Mavoli said proudly. "Already he's an expert on getting laid." "All right, you guys," Melvin said in a corporal's voice. "We move up north in half an hour. Let's go." Bobby Limbeck kissed Marie Louise's hand. "Mansei," he said, using the only Korean word he knew. It voiced a gallant hope, for it meant, "May our country live 10,000 years." Sergeant Shaw was capable of weeping objective, simulated tears at several points in the story of his life, which Captain Marco always encouraged him to tell to pass the time during quiet hours on patrol. The sergeant's rage-daubed face would shine like a ripped-out heart flung onto stones in moonlight, and the captain liked to hear the story because, in a way, it was like hearing Orestes gripe about Clytemnestra. Captain Marco treasured poetic, literary, informational, and cross-referenced allusions, military and non-military. He was a reader. His point of motive was that on many army posts, one's off time could only be spent drinking, bridge playing, or reading. Marco enjoyed beer, abjured spirits. He had no head for cards. He always seemed to win from his superior officers. His fellow officers were used up on conversations of a non-professional nature, so he transshipped boxes of books about anything at all back and forth between San Francisco and wherever he was stationed at the time, because he was deeply interested in the problems of Bilbao bankers, the history of piracy, the paintings of Orozco, the modern French theater, the jurisprudential factors in mafia administration, the diseases of cattle, the works of Yeats, the ramblings of the Bible, the novels of Joyce Carey, the lordliness of doctors, the psychology of bullfighters, the ethnic choices of Arabs, the origin of trade winds, and very nearly anything else contained in any of the books which he paid to have selected at random by a stranger in a bookstore on Market Street and shipped to him wherever he happened to be. The sergeant's account of his past was ancient in its form and confusingly dramatic, as perhaps would have been a game of three-level chess between Richard Burbage and Sacha Guitry. It all seemed to revolve around his mother, a woman as ambitious as Daedalus. The sergeant was 22 years old. He was as ambivalent as a candle burning at both ends. Awake, his resentment was almost always at full boil. Asleep, Captain Marco could understand. It simmered and bubbled in the blackened iron pot of his memory. Raymond had made tech sergeant because he was a bleakly good soldier, and because he was the greatest natural marksman in the division. Any weapon he could lift, he could kill with. He pointed it languidly, pulled the trigger, and something always fell. Some of the men appreciated this quality very much and liked to be with or near Raymond when any action occurred, but otherwise he was scrupulously shunned by all of them. Raymond was a left-handed man of considerable height, to which he soared from wide hips, narrower shoulders, with a triangular face which suspended a pointed chin that was narrow and not very firm. The vertical halves of his face pouted together suddenly, projecting the effluvia of self-pity. His skin was immoderately white, which made the prominent veins of his arms and legs seem like blue neon tubing. His cropped hair was light blonde, and it grew down low and in a round shape over his forehead in a style affected by many American businessmen of a juvenile or eunuchoid turn. Despite that specific inventory of his countenance, Raymond was a very handsome man, very nearly a pretty man, who had heavy bones, great physical strength, and large, glaucous eyes with very large whites, like those of a carousel horse pursued by the Erinyes, those female avengers of antiquity. Despite that specific inventory of his countenance, Raymond was a very handsome man, very nearly a pretty man, who had heavy bones, great physical strength, and large, glaucous eyes with very large whites, like those of a carousel horse pursued by the Erinyes, those female avengers of antiquity. When the flautist Böhm engineered the new design and the new note value system for the clarinet, his system took a half note away from the thumb and a half note away from the third finger on each hand, as it would have been played on the standard Albert clarinet. By so doing, he created an aural schism and brought a most refined essence of prejudice to a world of music. He created two clarinetists with two subtle different qualities of sound where there had been one before, and provided amid this decadence many bitter misunderstandings. It was as if Raymond had been built by Herr Böhm to have had his full notes dropped to half notes, then to quarter notes, then to eighth notes, for his was an almost silent music, if music Raymond contained at all. In spite of himself, the captain liked Shaw, and the captain was a matured and thoughtful man. He liked Raymond, he had decided after much consideration of the phenomenon, because in one way or another, Shaw was continuously demonstrating that he liked the captain, and the captain was too wise a man to believe he could resist a plea like that. Nobody else in Company C liked Raymond, and perhaps no one else in the U.S. Army did. His comrades skirted him charily, or they pretended he was not there, as the fathers of daughters might regard an extremely high incidence of rape in their neighborhood. It was not that Raymond was hard to like. He was impossible to like. The captain, a thoughtful man, understood that Shaw's attention to him was merely the result of the pressure of a lifetime of having his nose rubbed in various symbols of authority. And as the sergeant's life story droned on and on, the captain came to realize that Raymond was pouring out a cherished monologue upon the beloved memory of his long-dead, betrayed father, who had been cast off by that bitch before Raymond could begin to love him. Amateur psychiatric prognosis can be fascinating when there is absolutely nothing else to do. Also fascinating was the captain's unending search for one small, even isolated address of Raymond's that was warm or in any human way attractive. Raymond's crushing contemptuousness aside, examining such a minute thing as the use of his hands while talking could be distressing, and the captain could see how little fragments of Raymond's personality had formed one great cold lump. Raymond could not stop using one horrid gesture, a go-way-you-bother-me flicking sort of gesture that he managed by having his long, fish-belly white fingers do small backhand brushing gestures to point up anything he said. Anything. He made the brush if he said good morning. If. He flicked air away from himself when he talked about the weather, politics, his field, food or gear. Anything. This digitorum gesticulazione was about the most irritating single bit of movement that the captain could ever remember seeing, and the captain was a thoughtful man. He had burst out against it early one morning while the sky was flinging light all around them, and Raymond had responded with a look of confusion, unaware of his fault, and disturbed. He had said to the captain that he, Flick Flick, did not understand what the captain meant, Brush Brush, and at last the captain had chosen to overlook it, as it was a relatively minor thing to a man who planned to be a wartime or a peacetime general of 4 stars some day, and who had permitted himself to decide that he would be crazy to refuse to understand a hero-worshipping sergeant whose relative might someday be chairman, or have direct influence on the chairman, of the Armed Services Committee of the Congress. It took that kind of objectivity to begin to tolerate Raymond, who was overfull of haughtiness. Raymond stood as though someone might have just opened a beach umbrella in his bowels. His very glance drawled when he deigned to look, seldom deigning to speak. There were wags in the company who said he put his lips up in curl papers each night, and all of these things are sure ingredients for arousing and sustaining the hostility of others. In theory, Shaw possessed a manner that should become a sergeant, and perhaps would become a drill sergeant or a Marine Corps public relations sergeant, but not a combat non-com, because under heightened realism, any attitude of power must always be accompanied by something that makes the privilege of power pardonable, and Shaw possessed no such rescuing qualifiers. His resentment of people, places, and things was a stifling, sensual thing. The captain's name was Ben Marco. He was a professional officer. He had been 6th in his class at the academy. His family had claimed the Army as a trade ever since a gunnery lieutenant who had grown up with Hernando de Soto at Barcarota, Spain, had left Pizarro for a look at the upper Mississippi. Marco followed his father's vocation because it was the last preserve of intimate feudalism, terraced ranks of fief and lord, where a major can always remain a peasant to a general, and a lieutenant a peon to a major. Marco was an intelligent intelligence officer. He looked like an Aztec crossed with an Eskimo, which was a fairly common Western American type, because the Aztec troops had drifted down from Siberia quite a long time before the Spaniards of Pizarro and Cortez had drifted north out of the Andes and Veracruz. He had metallic, copper-colored skin and strong, very white teeth, but aside from pigmentation, the straight black hair, the aboriginal look, and the eyes colored like Potage Saint-Germain, the potage's potage, green, he had had the contrasting fortune of being born in New Hampshire, where his father had been stationed at the time, just prior to duty in the Canal Zone. He stood 5 feet 11 and 3/4 inches, and looked small when standing beside Raymond. He had a powerful frame, and the meat on it was proportioned like the stone meat on an Epstein statue. He had the superior digestive system which affords almost every man blessed with it the repose to become thoughtful. They were an odd combination, the civilian who tried to talk like a soldier, and the soldier who had been ordered by the Joint Chiefs in this new and polite army to damn well learn how to talk like a civilian. The frosty Brahmin with the earthy, ambitious man. The pseudo-mystagogue with the counterpuncher. The inhibitory with the excitatory, the latter being a designation used by the physiologist Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. Marco led the intelligence and reconnaissance patrol of 9 men and his Sergeant Ray Shaw on their 14th reconnaissance that night. Chun-Jin, Marco's orderly, appeared suddenly at his elbow, out of the almost total darkness and persistent silence. Chun-Jin was the captain's interpreter, the general guide over terrain who, no matter where they were sent in Korea, always insisted gravely that he had been born within 2 miles of the spot. Chun-Jin was a very good man with a frying pan, a shoe brush, a broom, a shaving kit, and at crating and transshipping books to San Francisco. He was small and wiry. He was a very, very tough-looking fellow against any comparison. He had the look of a man who maybe had been pushed around a lot and then had taken his life into his hands by deciding not to take any more of that kind of stuff. He always looked them right in the eyes, from private to colonel, and he did not smile at any time. "What?" Marco said. "Bad here." "Why?" "Tricky." "How?" "Swamp all around 30 yards up, maybe quicksand." Nobody told me about any quicksand. How they know? All right. What do you want? All walk in single line next 200 yards. No. Patrol sink. It is tactically unsound to go forward in a single file. Then patrol sink in 30 yards. Only for 200 yards ahead. Yes, sir. We can't go around it. No, sir. All right. Pass the word. Raymond was at the head of the line, right behind Chunjin in guide position. Marco finished the 12-man line. I and our patrols go out at night unarmed except for knives. They are unarmed because rifle fire draws other fire, and I and our patrols do what they do by staying out of trouble. There was very little light from a pallid crescent of moon. There was about 20 feet of distance between each man. The line was about 70 yards long. When it had moved forward about 60 yards, 2 human forms rose up in front of and behind each man on the line. The forward form hit its man at the pit of the stomach with a rifle butt, while the back man brought the stock down hard at the back of each man's head when the bodies doubled forward. Excepting Chunjin, they all seemed to go down at the same time. It was an extremely silent action, a model action of its kind. Without pause, each 2-man team of attackers built a litter out of the 2 rifles and rolled their charges aboard. 2 non-coms checked each team out, talking quietly and occasionally slapping a man on the shoulder with approval and self-pleasure. Chunjin led the litter teams on a route that was at right angles to the direction taken by the patrol, across the dark, firm terrain. 22 men carried 11 bodies in the improvised stretchers at a rapid dog trot, while the non-coms sang the cadence in soft Russian. The patrol had been taken by 3 Company of the 35th Regiment of the 66th Airborne Division of the Soviet Army, a crack outfit that handled most of the flashy assignments in the sector, and dined out between these jobs with available North Korean broads and the young ladies of the Northeast Administrative Area, on the stories emanating therefrom. The patrol was taken to 2 trucks waiting a quarter-mile away. The trucks rode them 12 miles over bad terrain to a temporary airfield. A helicopter took them north at about 1,200 feet. They had cleared the Yalu before the first man began to climb back into sluggish consciousness to see a uniformed country boy from Ukhta holding a machine rifle at ready and grinning down at him. Dr. Yen Lo and his staff of 30 technicians, all of whom were Chinese except 2 overawed Uzbek neuropsychiatrists who had jointly won an Amalkin Award. As a reward, their section had arranged for them to spend a 30-day tour with this man whom they had always thought of as a shelf of books, or the voice behind the many professors in their short lives, the living monument to and the continental expander of the works of Pavlov. Installed their peculiar establishment during the night of July 6th, and worked at the fixtures necessary until mid-morning of July 7th. Their pharmacy was an elaborate affair, for one thing. For another, they had brought in 4 compact electronic computers. Included in the effects was an electrical switchboard that seemed large enough to have handled the lighting for the State Opera in Vienna, where quite possibly it originated. Old Yen was in fine spirits. He chatted freely about Pavlov and Salter, Krasnogorsky and Mainyant, Petrova and Bechtervov, Forlov and Roland, as though he had not made his departure from the mainstream of their doctrine some 9 years before, when he had come upon his own radical technology for descent into the unconscious mind with the speed of a mine-shaft elevator. He made jokes with his staff. He taunted the 2 Uzbeks, just as though he were not a god, about Herr Freud, whom he called that Austrian gypsy fortune-teller, or the Teuton fantast, or that licensed gossip, and he permitted his chief of staff to visit General Kostromaz's chief to arrange for the mess and the billeting of his people. During the pleasantly cool evening before the morning when the American I&R patrol was brought in for him, Yen Lo and his staff of 30 men and women sat in a large circle on a broad, grassy space, and as the moon went higher and the hour got later, and all of the voices seemed to fall into lower pitch preparing for sleepiness, Yen Lo told them a fairy story, which was set 39 centuries before they had been born, about a young fisherman and a beautiful princess who had journeyed through the province of Chengtu. The American patrol was brought to the research pavilion at 6:09 the following morning, July 8th. Yen Lo had them bathed, then inoculated each of them personally. They were dressed again while they slept and sat down, excepting for Raymond Shaw, one man to a cot to a cubicle. When Yen Lo got 3 implantation teams started on them, staying with each team through the originating processes until he had assured himself that all had been routined with smoothness. When he had assured himself to the point of downright fussiness, he brought his assistant and 2 nurses with him into the corner apartment where Raymond slept and began the complex work on the reconstruction of the sergeant's personality. The principles of excitation, as outlined by Pavlov in 1894, are immutable and apply to every psychological problem, no matter how remote it may appear at first. Conditioned reflexes do not involve volitional thinking. Words produce associative reflexes. Splendid, marvelous, and magnificent give us an unconscious lift because we have been conditioned to that feeling in them. The words hot, boiling, and steam have a warm quality because of their associativity. Inflection and gesture have been conditioned as intensifiers of word conditionings, as Andrew Salter, the Pavlovian disciple, writes. Salter shows that when one sees the essence of the unconscious mind to be conditioning, one is in a strategic position to develop a sound understanding of the deepest wellsprings of human behavior. Conditioning is based upon associative reflexes that use words or symbols as triggers of installed automatic reactions. Conditioning, called brainwashing by the news agencies, is the production of reactions in the human organism through the use of associative reflexes. Yen Lo approached human behavior in terms of fundamental components instead of metaphysical labels. His meaningful goal was to implant in the subject's mind the predominant motive, which was that of submitting to the operator's commands. To construct behavior which would at all times strive to put the operator's exact intentions into execution, as if the subject were playing a game or acting a part, and to cause a redirection of his movements by remote control through second parties, or third, or 50th parties, 12,000 miles removed from the original commands if necessary. The first thing a human being is loyal to, Yen Lo observed, is his own conditioned nervous system. On the morning of July 9th, the members of the American patrol, excepting Shaw, Marco, and Chun-Jin, the Korean interpreter, were allowed to walk in and out of each other's rooms, and to lounge around in a comfortable common room where there were magazines only 2 or 3 years old, printed in Chinese and Russian, and an Australian seed catalog dated spring 1944 with attractive color pictures. Yen Lo had conditioned the men to enjoy all the Coca-Cola they could drink, which was, in actuality, Chinese Army-issue tea served in tin cups. There were playing cards, card tables, and some dice. Each man had been given 20 strips of brown paper and told that these were $1, $5, $10, and $20 bills of U.S. currency, depending on how they had been marked in pencil on the corners. The yellow rattan carpet, the simulated sunlight from the fluorescent tubing, and the happy blonde furniture in the windowless room were quite cheery and bright, and the men had been instructed to enjoy their surroundings. About 30 pin-up pictures of Chinese and Indian movie stars were clustered thickly on one wall around a calendar that advertised Tiger Beer of Singapore, 14% by volume, and offered a demi-nude Caucasian cutie dressed for Coney Island in the mode of the summer of 1931. There were cigarettes and cigars for everyone, and Yen Lo had allowed his boys to have a little fun in the selection of outlandish tobacco substitutes because he knew that word of it would pass through the armies, based upon the sure knowledge of what made armies laugh, rubbing more sheen into the legend of the Yen Lo unit. They would be talking about how much those Americans had savored those cigars and cigarettes from Lvov and Cape Vizhneva inside of 1 week, as yak dung tastes good like a cigarette should. The 9 men had been conditioned to believe that they were leveling off on a Sunday night after a terrific 3-day pass from a post 40 minutes outside of New Orleans. They were all convinced that each had won a lot of money, and that in spending most of it they had reached exhaustion with warm edges and an expensive, calm feeling. Ed Mavole had received the spirit of Yen Lo's suggestion so strongly that he confided to Silvers that he was slightly worried and wondered if maybe he wouldn't be doing the right thing if he stepped out for a minute to a prophylactic station. They were worn down from all that whiskey and those broads, but they were relaxed and euphoric. 3 times a day, Yen's staff men gave each man his deep mental massage, stacking up the layers of light and shadow neatly within each unconscious mind, as ordered. The men spent 2 days in and out of the common room, sleeping and eating when they felt like it, believing it was always the same time on the same Sunday night, remembering that clutch of sensational broads as if they had just rolled off them. The distinguished commission of distinguished men, including one who was a member of the Central Committee, and another who was a security officer wearing the uniform of a lieutenant general of the Soviet Army, inasmuch as he was traveling through a military zone, and because he happened to like to wear uniforms, arrived with their staffs at the Tunghua military airport, accompanied by 2 round Chinese dignitaries at 5 minutes to noon on the morning of July 12, 1951. There were 14 in the group. Gomel, the Politburo man in mufti, had a staff of 5 men who were in uniform. Birezova, the security officer in uniform, had a staff of 4 men and a young woman in mufti. The 2 Russian groups seemed remote from each other, and from the 2 young Chinese, who may only have seemed young because of an 83% vegetable diet. They all ate at General Kostroma's mess. He was the Army Corps commander who had been transferred too suddenly from work that had suited him so well at the Army War College to be pressed into supervising Chinese who seemed to have no understanding of military mission and who were fearfully spendthrift with troops. There appeared to be 4 entirely separate groups dining at the same large table. First, Kostroma and his staff, bravely silent men who realized now that they had made a chafing mistake when they had wangled places with this general. They were continuously wondering where they had gone wrong in their judgment, trying to analyze retrospectively whether anyone along the line had encouraged them to think that a berth with Kostroma would be a shrewd move. General Kostroma himself remained mute, because a Central Committee member was present, and as Kostroma had evidently made mistakes in the past, which he had not known he had been making, he did not want to make another. The second group, Gomel's, was made up of men whose average length of service among the trench-mortar subtleties of party practice and ascent through the ranks had been a total of 18 years and 4 months each. They were professional politicians, wholly independent of the whims of popular vote. They saw their community duty as that of appearing wise and stern, hence they observed silence. The Birezova group was silent because they were security people. Birezova is dead now. For that matter, so is General Kostroma. Those 3 groups, however silent, were well aware of the 4th, chaired by Yen Lo, DMS, DPH, DSC, BSP, RHS, who kept his own executive staff, and the 2 young, one should call them young-looking rather than young, Chinese dignitaries, in high-pitched, continual laughter until the meal had spent itself. All jokes were in Chinese. Even without pointed gestures, Yen managed to convey the feeling that all of the gusty sallies were at their gallant Russian allies' expense. Gomel glared and sweated a form of chicken fat. Birezova picked at his food expressionlessly and pared an apple with a bayonet. Gomel, who established himself as being her sign before anything else, was as stocky as an opera hat, with a bullet head and stainless steel false teeth. It would be difficult to be more proletarian-seeming than Gomel. The teeth had made him carnivorously unphotogenic, and therefore unknown to the newspaper readers of the West. He dressed in the chic moujik style affected by his leader, loose silk everythings rushing downward into the tops of soft black boots. His smell tended to worry his personal staff, lest their expression make it seem as though they were personally disloyal to him. He was a specialist in heavy industrial management. Birezova, who was younger than Gomel, represented the new Soviet executive and resembled a fire hydrant in a run-down neighborhood. Short, squat, stained, and seamed, his head seeming to come to a point, and his fibrous hair parted in several impossible places like a coconut's. Birezova was all brass, a very important person. Gomel was important, no doubt about that. He had dachi in Moscow and the Crimea, but there were only 2 men higher than Birezova in the entire, exhaustingly delicate business of Soviet security. Each man had successfully concealed from the other that he was present at the seminar as the personal and confidential representative of Joseph Stalin, proprietor. Yen Lo's lectures began at 4 p.m. on July 11th. General Kostroma was not invited to attend. The group strolled in pairs, not unlike dons moving across a campus, toward the lovely copse which framed that little red schoolhouse wherein Yen Lo had inserted so many new values and perspectives into the minds of 11 Americans. It was a glorious summer afternoon, not too hot, not too cool. The excessive humidity of the morning had disappeared. The food had been excellent. The single extraordinary sight in the informal but stately procession led by Yen Lo and Pa Cha, the senior Chinese statesman present, was that of Chun Jin, the Korean interpreter hitherto attached to the U.S. Army as orderly and guide for Captain Marco, walking at Biryozova's side, chewing on and smoking a large cigar which was held in his small teeth at a jaunty angle. Had any member of the American patrol still retained any semblance of normal perspective, he would have been startled at seeing Chun Jin there, for when natives were captured by a military party of either side, their throats were always cut. Yen Lo had telephoned ahead from the mess, so that when the commission entered the auditorium of the research pavilion, the American patrol had been seated in a long line across the raised stage behind a centered lectern. They watched the Sino-Soviet group enter with expressions of amused tolerance and boredom. Yen Lo moved directly to the platform, rummaging in his attaché case while the others found seats, by echelon, in upright wooden chairs. Large, repeated 7-color lithographs of Stalin and Mao were interspersed on 3 walls between muscularly typographed yellow-on-black posters that read, "Let us stop imitating," as a headline, and as text, "Piracy and imitations of designs hamper the development and expansion of export trade. It is regrettable that there are quite a few cases of piracy in the People's Republic. Piracy injures the Chinese people's international prestige, causes the boycott of Chinese goods, and makes Chinese designers lose interest in making creative efforts." The smell of new paint and shellac, and the delicious, clean odor of wood shavings floated everywhere in the air of the room, offering the deep, deep luxury of absolute simplicity. On stage, Ben Marco sat on the end of the line at stage right, in the Mr. Bones position. Sergeant Shaw sat on the other end of the line, stage left. Between them, left to right, were Hyken, Gosfield, Little, Silvers, Mavole, Melvin, Freeman, Lembeck. Mavole was at stage center. All of the men were alert and serene. The audience was divided, physically and by prejudice. Gommel did not approve of Yen Lo or his work. Biryazova happened to see in Yen Lo's methods possibilities that would hasten revolutionary causes by 50 years. 5 staff members sat behind each of these men, who sat on opposite sides of the room, recreating an impression of 2 Alphonse Capones, 1899 to 1947, attending the Chicago Opera of 1927. The 2 Chinese representatives sat off to the left, closer to the platform than the others, as bland as 2 jars of yogurt. Yen Lo winked at them now and again as he made his address, with asides in various Chinese dialects to annoy Gommel. The stage was raised about 30 inches from the floor and was draped with bunting of the USSR and the People's Republic of China. Yen Lo stood behind the centered lectern. He was wearing an ankle-length dress of French blue that buttoned at the side of his throat and fell in straight, comfortable lines. The skin of his face was lap-streaked or clinker-built into overlapping horizontal folds like the sides of some small boats, and it was the color of raw sulfur. His eyes were hooded and dark, which made him seem even older than did the wrinkles. His entire expression was theatrically sardonic, as though he had been advised by prepaid cable that the late Dr. Fu Manchu had been his uncle. Yen Lo instructed the Russians with bright contempt, with the slightly nauseated fixity of a vegetarian who must remain in a closed room with carnivores. He used a pointer to indicate the various U.S. Army personnel behind him. He introduced each man courteously and by name. He explained their somewhat lackadaisical manners by saying that each American was under the impression that he had been forced by a storm to wait in a small hotel in New Jersey, where space restrictions made it necessary for him to watch and listen to a meeting of a ladies' garden club. Yen motioned to Raymond Shaw. "Pull your chair over here, Raymond, if you please," he said in English. Raymond sat beside Yen Lo, who placed his hand lightly on the young man's shoulder as he spoke to the group. Raymond's bearing was superciliously haughty. His pose, had it been executed in oils, might have been called the young duke among the fishmongers. His legs were crossed, and his head was cocked with his chin outstretched. The male stenographer on Gomel's team and the female stenographer on Birizova's squad flipped their notebooks open on their laps at the same instant, preparing to record Yen's remarks. The shorter Chinese emissary, a chap named Wen Chang, got his hand under his dress and scratched his crotch. "This, comrades, is the famous Raymond Shaw, the young man you have flown nearly 8,000 miles to see," Yen Lo said in Russian. "Your chief, Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria, saw this young man in his mind's eye only as a disembodied ideal, as long as 2 years before he was appointed to head the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Security in 1938, and that was 13 eventful years ago. I feel I must add at this point my humble personal gratitude for his warm encouragement and fulfilling inspiration. It is to Lavrenti Pavlovich that this little demonstration will do homage today." Biryazova nodded his head graciously in silent acknowledgment of the tribute. Then the 5 staff people behind him just as graciously nodded their heads. Yen Lo told the group that Raymond Shaw was a unique combination of the exceptional, both internally and externally. With oratorical roundness, he presented Raymond's external values first. He told them about Raymond's stepfather, the governor, of Raymond's mother, a woman of wealth and celebrity, of Raymond's uncle, a distinguished member of the U.S. diplomatic service. Raymond himself was a journalist, and when this little war was over, might even rise to become a distinguished journalist. All of these attributes, he said, made Raymond welcome everywhere within the political hierarchy of the United States, within both parties. The line of American soldiers listened to the lecture politely, as though they had to make the best of listening to club women discuss fun with hydrangeas. Bobby Limbeck's attention had strayed. Edma Vole, who was still firmly convinced that he had just finished the most active 3-day pass of his Army career, had to stuff a fist into his mouth to conceal a yawn. Captain Marco looked from Shaw to Yen Lo to Gomel to Biryazova's recording assistant, a fine-looking piece with a passionate nose who was wearing no lipstick and no brassiere. Marco mentally fitted her with a B-cup, enjoyed the diversion, then turned back to try to pay attention to Yen Lo, who was saying that as formidable as were Raymond's external attributes, he possessed internal weaknesses that Yen would show as being incredible strengths for an assassin. "I'm sure that all of you have heard that old wives' tale," Yen stated, "which is concerned with the belief that no hypnotized subject may be forced to do that which is repellent to his moral nature, whatever that is, or to his own best interests. That is nonsense, of course. You note-takers might set down a reminder to consult Brenman's paper, Experiments in the Hypnotic Production of Antisocial and Self-Injurious Behavior, or Wells' 1941 paper, which was titled, I believe, Experiments in the Hypnotic Production of Crime, or Andrew Salter's remarkable book, Conditioned Reflex Therapy, to name only 3. Or, if it offends you to think that only the West is studying how to manufacture more crime and better criminals against modern shortages, I suggest Krasnogorsky's Primary Violence Motivation, or Sierov's The Unilateral Suggestion to Self-Destruction. For any of you who are interested in massive negative conditioning, there is Frederick Wertham's The Seduction of the Innocent, which demonstrates how thousands have been brought to antisocial actions through children's cartoon books. However, enough of that. You won't read them anyway. The point I am making is that those who speak of the need for hypnotic suggestion to fit a subject's moral code should revise their concepts. The conception of people acting against their own best interests should not startle us. We see it occasionally in sleepwalking and in politics every day." Raymond sighed. The youngest man on Gomel's staff, seated farthest back in the rows of irregularly placed chairs, picked his nose surreptitiously through the ensuing silence. Beryozova's recording assistant, her breasts pointing straight out through the cotton blouse without benefit of B-cup, stared at Marco just below the belt buckle. The Chinese had become aware of how much Comrade Gommel smelled like a goat. Bobby Lembeck was thinking about Marie-Louise. Most of the Russians understood clearly that what Yenlo had done was to concentrate the purpose of all propaganda upon the mind of one man. They knew that reflexes could be conditioned to the finest point, so that if the right person leveled his finger from the right place at the right time and cried deviationist or Trotskyite, that any man's character could be assassinated or a man could be liquidated. Conditioning was intensified repetition. Ed Mavoli had to go to the John. He looked furtively to the right and left, then he caught Marco's eye and made a desperate series of lifts with his eyebrows, combined with compulsive face tics. Marco coughed. Yen Lo looked over at him serenely, then nodded. Marco went to Yen's side and whispered a message. Yen shouted a command in Chinese, and a man appeared in the open doorway at the back of the auditorium. Yen suggested that Mavoli follow that man, and he told Mavoli not to be embarrassed because the ladies did not understand Chinese. Mavoli thanked him, then he turned to the line of sitting soldiers and said, "Anybody else?" Bobby Lembeck joined him, and they left the room. Marco returned to his chair. Gommel demanded to know what the hell was going on anyway. Yen Lo explained, deadpan, in Russian, and Gommel made an impatient, exasperated face. Yen Lo carried his thesis forward. Neurotics and psychotics, he told the group, are too easily canted into unpredictable patterns, and the constitutional psychopaths, those total waste products of all breeding, were too frivolously based. Of course, he explained, the psychotic group, known as paranoiacs, had always provided us with the great leaders of the world, and always would. That was a clinical, historical fact. With their dedicated sense of personal mission, a condition that has been allowed to become tainted semantically, he pointed out, with the psychiatric label of megalomania, with their innate ability to falsify hampering conditions of the past, to prevent unwanted distortion of the future, with that relentless protective cunning that places the whole world in revolving turn into position as their enemies, paranoiacs simply had to be placed in the elite stock of any leader pool. Mavoli and Lembeck came back, picking their way carefully through the chairs and moving very properly, Mavoli leading. They climbed back upon the platform almost daintily, while the speaker and the audience waited politely. Mavoli inadvertently broke wind as he sat down. He excused himself with a startled exclamation and flushed with embarrassment before all those garden ladies. His consternation sent Gommel into barking laughter. Yen Lo waited icily until the commissar had finished his pleasure, whacking his packed thighs and wheezing, then pointing his stunted finger up at Mavoli on the platform, while he guffawed helplessly. When the laughter finally subsided, Yen threw an aside at his countrymen in Chinese. They tittered like Tlibi, which shut Gommel up. Yen Lo continued blandly. Although the paranoiacs make the great leaders, it is the resenters who make their best instruments, because the resenters, those men with cancer of the psyche, make the great assassins. His audience was listening intently again. It is difficult to define true resentment for you. The Spanish medical philosopher, Dr. Gregorio Marañón, described it as a passion of the mind, some blow of life which produces a sharp moan of protest when it is not transformed by the normal mental mechanism into ordinary resignation, ends by becoming the director of our slightest reactions. Raymond's mother helped to bring about his condition to the largest and most significant extent, for, in Andrew Salter's words, the human fish swim about at the bottom of the great ocean of atmosphere, and they develop psychic injuries as they collide with one another. Most mortal of all are the wounds gotten from the parent fish. It has been said, the Chinese doctor continued, that only the man who is capable of loving everything is capable of understanding everything. The resentful man is a human with the capacity for affection so poorly developed that his understanding for the motives of others very nearly does not exist. Yen Lo patted Raymond's shoulder sympathetically and smiled down at him regretfully. Raymond is a man of melancholic and reserved psychology. He is afflicted with total resentment. It is slowly fomenting within him before your eyes. Raymond's heart is arid. At the core of his defects is his concealed tendency to timidity, sexual and social, both of which are closely linked, which he hides behind that formidably severe and haughty cast of countenance. This weakness of will is compounded by his constant need to lean upon someone else's will, and now, at last, that has been taken care of for the rest of Raymond's life. "Has the man ever killed anyone?" Biryazova asked loudly. "Have you ever murdered anyone, Raymond?" Yenlo asked the young man solicitously. "No, sir." "Have you ever killed anyone?" "No, sir." "Not even in combat?" "In combat, yes, sir, I think so, sir." "Thank you, Raymond." Dr. Maragnon tells us that resentment is entirely impersonal, as opposed to hatred, which has a strictly individual cast and presupposes a duel between the hater and the hated. The reaction of the resenter is directed against destiny. The pace of Yenlo's voice slowed, and it had softened when he spoke again. "Pity Raymond, if you can. Beneath his sad and stony mask, wary and hypocritical, you must remember that his every act, every thought, and all of his ends are permeated with an indefinable bitterness. An infinite anguish must mark his life. He flees the world to find himself in solitude, and solitude terrifies him because it is too close to his despair. His soul has been rubbed to shreds between the ambivalence of wanting and not wanting, of being able and unable, of loving and hating, and as Dr. Maragnon has demonstrated, his feeling lives like two brothers, at one and the same time Siamese twins and deadly enemies." The commission stared at this dream by Lavrenti Beria, the perfectly prefabricated assassin, this bored, too handsome, blond young man with the pointed chin and the pointed ears, whose mustard-colored eyes looked through them as a cat's would, and who would not be able to stop destroying once the instructions had been fed into him. All but 4 of them had had experience in one Soviet or another with the old-fashioned, wild-eyed, cause-torn name-killers of the domestic politics of the past 25 years, and every one of those had been a shaky 1,000-to-1 shot as far as being able to guarantee success. But here was Caesar's son to be sent into Caesar's chamber to kill Caesar. Steady, responsible, shock-proof assassins were needed at home, because assassination was a stratagem requiring secrecy and control, and if an assassination were not to be committed secretly, then it had to be arranged discreetly and smoothly, so that the ruling cliques realized that it was an occasion not to be advertised. If the assassin were to be used in the West, as this one would be, where sensationalism is not only desirable but politically essential, the blow needed to be struck at exactly the right time and place, at a national emotional apogee, as it were, so that the selected Messiah who would succeed the slain ruler could then defend all of his people from the threatening and monstrous element at whose doorstep the assassination of an authentic national hero could swiftly and effectively be laid. Biryazova was thinking of Yenlo's proud claim of prolonging post-hypnotic amnesia into eternity. Biryazova had been life-trained in security work, particularly that having to do with Soviet security problems in North America, where this killer would operate. If a normally conditioned Anglo-Saxon could be taught to kill, then to have no memory of having killed, or even of having had the thought of killing, he could feel no guilt. If he could feel no guilt, he could not fall into the trap of betraying fear of being caught. If he could not feel guilt or the fear of being caught, he would remain an outwardly normal, productive, sober, and respectful member of his community, so that, as Biryazova saw it, this killer was very close to being police-proof, and the method by which he was created must be very, very carefully controlled in its application to other men within the Soviet Union, specifically within Moscow, more specifically within the Kremlin. Gomel was multiplying Raymond. If Yenlo could manufacture one of these, he could manufacture an elite corps of what could be the most extraordinary personal troops a leader could have. By having immutable loyalty built into a cadre of perhaps 100 men, a leader could not only take power, but he would become unseatable because, after the flawless, selfless guardians had removed the others, they could be conditioned to take portfolios under the new leader from which they would never plot against the new leader, and would reflexively choose to die themselves rather than see any harm come to him. Gommel felt himself grow taller, but all at once he thought of the power of Yen Lo, and it spoiled his vision. Yen Lo would have to manufacture these assistants. Who would ever know what else he had built into their minds, such as acting to kill within an area where they were supposed to be utterly immobile? He had disliked Yen Lo before this, but now he began to feel a bitter hatred toward him. But what could be done to such a man? How could fear be put into him to control him?